Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard the spacious cabin. Roominess extends even to the powder rooms, which look like those in a private home. Delicious food adds to the enjoyment.
Ah, the golden days of air travel under strict government regulation. Here at Pan American Airways, for example. Living it up in first class, even back here in coach, legroom to burn, silverware, tablecloths. Right, Susie? In short, not so long ago, flying was often luxurious and priced accordingly. In 1958, Mom, Dad, and Susie here paid a total of something like $10,000 in today's money to fly round trip in coach, New York to London. A regular round trip, LA to Miami, was more than $2,000 adjusted for inflation. So how come we can fly LA to Miami today for several hundred? Where did the high fares go? Or the legroom, powder room, and chess sets for that matter? Where, finally, are the airlines of 1958? Braniff, Eastern, Pan Am itself. Well, they all went the way of regulation, destroyed by the gale winds of free market competition, what one famous economist called creative destruction, destroying the old to leave room for the creation of something more efficient. In a word, the airline industry was deregulated. For some, that was better, for some, worse, and deregulation and its effects are what this video's about. Up until 1978, the U.S. government tightly regulated air travel. Any airline that flew between states was engaged in interstate commerce, and thus under federal jurisdiction. Routes, schedules, and most important, fares were strictly controlled by the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB. Here's the picture in the form of a graph. On the vertical axis, price, here of domestic air travel measured in pennies per mile, today's pennies, for each mile flown by one passenger. A nickel per passenger mile, a dime per passenger mile, and so on. On the horizontal axis, quantity. Here, the total number of passenger miles flown in 1 year in billions. And finally, the supply of air travel and demand for air travel meeting at equilibrium, say here. In which case, you can draw a line to the market price, another to the market quantity. But the actual price was regulated by government. Many economists thought it was higher than equilibrium, though without a market, no one knew for sure. A price above equilibrium would be inefficient and result in a surplus, the gap between what suppliers would provide at this inflated price and what consumers would demand. A surplus, in this case, of empty seats, extra legroom, etc. So to help counter the economic slowdown of the late 1970s, Democratic President Jimmy Carter lured Cornell economist Alfred Kahn to Washington to unleash free market competition. The theory was to let the market drive prices down to equilibrium and bring in new customers, new airlines, new jobs. Let the market create, let the market destroy.
Well, I was aware of the possibility that you would have competition that might even be regarded as destructive, but it was a risk I was willing to take. And still am.
Still are.
Oh, absolutely.
So you don't regret deregulating the airlines?
Oh, dear. Not at all. I mean, it's the greatest thing I ever did in my life, other than have children. What I did has been extraordinarily beneficial to millions and millions and millions of people every year who couldn't afford to travel, who now can visit their grandparents, which now strikes home to me, go home for vacation from college, who can travel and indeed can be tourists and go to Europe for $200 or $300, have broader horizons.
Yes, says Kahn, the supposed golden era was more comfortable for those who could afford it. High fares kept lines short, besides which line length was actually regulated. But then came the recession of the 1970s. Passengers began to stay away in droves. Time to cut prices and lure them back? Not under regulation. So Alfred Kahn deregulated the industry for its own good and let competition produce cheaper seats, fuller flights. One cheeky, low-cost competitor, Southwest Airlines, had begun serving Texas in 1972. Only Texas. But as an in-state carrier, it could set its own prices, its own dress code.
Remember what it was like before Southwest Airlines? You didn't have hostesses in hot pants. Remember?
With deregulation, Southwest and other discounters were allowed to compete on price with national carriers, who could now compete on price with each other. The good news? Airfares started heading back down to earth, and have just kept getting lower pretty much ever since. Flyers have become more and more frequent, filling more and more planes. On the graph, the supply curve shifted right, more supply. Equilibrium shifted accordingly. And with equilibrium determining the price line now, the new equilibrium was in fact at a lower price. The demand curve proved to be quite price elastic. Consumers in this range were very responsive to price. So more people took to the air and total airline industry revenues went up, as they always do when the elasticity is greater than 1. So much for the good news. The bad news? Well, among other things, less room for legs, for chess, for amenities that proved about as durable as a house of cards. Critics charged that competition was turning an airline seat into a commodity, airliners into cattle cars.
What do you say to people like me who say, gee, I liked it better in the old days. I'm more worried now about whether the planes are safe. I'm more uncomfortable. Go back, go back.
All right, let me say two things. First, let's get safety out of the way. Airline accident rates are down much more than 50%. And safety has continued to improve. We never deregulated safety. But discomfort, in part, I have to say, as we used to say in the Army TS, the major benefit of deregulation was to make travel available for common folk.
So you don't care that I'm not as comfortable as I was?
Well, I really do want a high-quality, high-price option available, but you can't complain at having to pay what it really costs. And what it really costs is that you're denying that space to somebody else.
Alfred Kahn is a liberal Democrat, but first and always, he's an economist. That means he's a devout believer that the market should conserve any scarce resource by charging all of us what it really costs.
The beauty of the intense price competition that was set off and made possible by deregulation has had the effect that the average load factor, planes were filled 52.8% full in a decade before deregulation. In the last several years, they've been filled over 70%.
But deregulation also meant tougher competition for the older carriers, who flew older, less fuel-efficient planes, employed older union workers with generous pensions, had higher costs than new airlines for a lot of reasons. And then came a real 1-2 punch. The recession of 2001, followed by September 11th.
We're sitting here at the table at a moment in time when US Air, playing right out the window there, is in bankruptcy. United has just gone into bankruptcy.
Do you know how many restaurants that get opened every year last beyond the first 5 years? It's a tiny, tiny fraction. That's part of the market economy and the competitive market economy. If you believe in competition as the best possible protector of consumers, you have to accept losses of money by investors.
Of course, the 2001 recession and 9/11 showed graphically that competition can be very destructive, especially in a shrinking market. As the demand curve shifted left, the price line dropped even further, and we started hearing about airlines petitioning the U.S. government for assistance. Lots of airlines perhaps going out of business. Now, ask yourself, why were some in trouble, some not? Because at the simplest level, newcomers had lower costs than the old-timers. JetBlue at just over 6 cents a passenger mile, Southwest just above 7, AirTran at a tick over 8 cents, and above that, the desperate. Delta north of 10 cents, American and United above 12, U.S. Airways above 14 cents a passenger mile. Professor John Min spells out the implications.
Here's the price line. If you're below that, you make profit, economic profit. If you're above that, it's kind of reverse. You drown and you die. well, you should get out. And what's interesting is that based on that chart, I could pretty much sequence out as a price line continues to fall, which airline would go into bankruptcy in which order. And therefore, maybe I think it's for US Air just went back into it. We were pretty much correct. We can say, okay, that one, that one, that one, that one. What about Southwest? They're doing fine. What about JetBlue? They're doing fine.
The bottom line of the story and of this video is simple. Deregulation meant competition, which did the job the deregulators thought it would, driving down the price of domestic air travel, depending on how you adjust yesterday's prices to the present, from somewhere between 25 to 50 cents per passenger mile to today's 9 cents or so. Even the carriers in trouble these days, those above the current price line, are vastly more efficient than in the era of regulation, and as a result, consumers have benefited.
The real protection of the public has got to be competition. And it was overwhelmingly because regulation suppressed competition that I opposed it, as did the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, as did the Federal Trade Commission, as did all other people who are really concerned about the interest of the poor, people of modest means, and people coming into the labor market.
And says Alfred Kahn, more than a quarter century after the biggest policy push of his career, deregulation has created and destroyed, bringing air travel to those of modest means, but often uncomfortably, growing new airlines and new jobs, but eliminating old airlines and old jobs. There were costs to deregulation, Kahn concedes, but they were outweighed, he thinks, by the benefits. And that's all any economist can ask.